June 28th, 2024 Project Echo Dementia session. I am Chris Rhoads, and you are stuck with me today for both facilitating and doing the didactic. So I'm looking forward to a conversation. Just a brief overview of our format for those of you who are new and those who are coming back. Welcome back. Glad to have you all. We'll do some quick opening notes and reminders. We'll do some very brief kind of introductions, perhaps, or at least put some info in the chat if you'd be so kind. And then we're going to dive into driving and dementia today. And we don't have a formal case presentation, but experience with this is that there will be plenty to talk about. This is one of the hardest aspects of what we do, I think, and some of the hardest discussions. Hoping to have plenty of time to talk about what's worked for people, the struggles you have. And my hope with the didactic today too is to give you some resources, some tools to make what is difficult work slightly easier, more tolerable. So just some reminders. If you don't have your name pre-populated, it looks like most of you do. If you could put your first name, last name, clinic, that would be great. Making sure that your microphone's muted, and remember to say your name when you unmute. If you're able to, it's great to have video on. We'd love to see our community and lovely faces. And if there are more than one of you in a room, it'd be great just to have that info too, so we can keep track of attendance for CME and other purposes. Somebody in here. Speaking of CME, if you are a University of Washington faculty, staff, or student, here is the process for you to send your email address to that number and then text this number to that number, and that will get you registered. And you can do that, I think, up to an hour after the session. So we'll put this info back up there afterwards too, but feel free to take a picture if you need to. Everyone else, we will track through our usual format, and thanks to Samantha for track of that. So again, we don't have any formal cases today, but we always love cases, and I think we've got a couple that are percolating out there to be discussed in the not too distant future. But we'll always happy to hear from you. No case is too simple, no case is too complex or mundane. We always learn something. So your contact info for Sammy. We've talked about these a bunch, but just a few other echoes that are out there, or resources that may inform your practice, including some consultation and conference series, psychiatry grand rounds. These are all on the slide deck that you'll receive after the session today. When we do discuss clinical information, making sure that we do our best to protect PHI, particularly in smaller communities where even innocuous detail may be revelatory of someone's identity, making sure we're mindful of that. Of course, these sessions are all recorded on the website. Love your feedback. So look forward to a 1-minute post-session survey. We are accredited for CME. I don't have any disclosures, nor does anybody else on the planning team for this. There's a pretty strict mitigation process when there are disclosures to be made. Here's our hub team. I continue to reflect, and I was mentioning this yesterday during a meeting, that this is really such a unique and wonderful collaborative effort that, while administrated through the University of Washington Department of Neurology, it's a multi-organizational effort. And I think that is both unusual, but also just a function of the wonderful work of the Dementia Action Collaborative. And really a privilege and an honor to get to work with so many wonderful people through the DAC and then through this specific offshoot or project of DAC. Here are you all, or most of you, or some of you, out in different parts of our state. We are still very, very interested in enhancing our community, and the particular focus on FQHCs. So look forward to some new members joining us. And then let's just get right into it. So I am pleased to do an update on this. I did a driving and dementia talk for Echo Geriatrics gosh, probably back in 2016, 17, and then have done one for us, our community, back in 2021, I think. So there's a few more things to talk about. And of course, this is such a critical and difficult topic. And my hopes are, by the end of the didactic, and certainly by the end of our conversation together, talking about the most prevalent risk factors that would undermine driving capacity and skills, to talk about what screening tools are out there, the strengths and the weaknesses, limitations of those, and more importantly, resources and referral process for further evaluation when that is indicated. I also want to highlight that I see driving as a really great example of procedural memory on top of a bunch of other things. So it's this overlearned but very complex multidimensional task that a lot of us do without having to think about it, right? If you really stop and think about all the things that go into driving, including the sensory components, the motor components, the cognitive components of synthesizing information, judgment, visual closure, all the things that we do, top of orientation and wayfinding, reaction time, processing speed, all these things are critical for driving. But we can do it and hold a conversation or have a snack, or so we really capitalize on that habit memory. And in a way, when we think about dementia, there's some resilience there as other types of memory change, but habit memory doesn't, which causes a tension of when is it time to retire from driving, because these other things have become impacted despite that habit memory serving a purpose of keeping driving going. There are also psychological and emotional domains about roles and meaning and purpose of, I'm the driver for the family, or I'm the driver for my friends to get to the bridge group. Driving is not just about transportation, it is identity, it's freedom. Think back to when you first got your driver's license, the amount of freedom and just the world opening up by being able to go where you want to go when you want to go there. You have the cash and the wheels to do so. And it's something too that I have to remind myself that it is not a right. Driving is a privilege. And I do a fair amount of capacity evaluations for different types of decision making or capacities. And in my mind, first and foremost, you're considering taking away someone's rights when you're making a decision about financial decision making or testamentary capacity. And here, by looking at driving capacity, you're not removing someone's rights, but you certainly are altering their life in a major way. And you have to balance that, right? Certainly lots of ethical and legal dilemmas, and we'll get to some of those as we talk about reporting. How protected are you versus what is your obligation? The other challenge with this is there's a lot of literature on driving and dementia, a lot of studies, but they vary wildly in terms of how they are done. Some involve putting devices in cars and tracking, kind of just naturalistically monitoring people's driving habits. Some are done with an in-person, in-vehicle evaluation. Some are done with a simulator, and some are done with just office assessment of skills that are involved in driving. So there's a tremendous amount of heterogeneity, which makes comparison across those studies challenging. We do know from all those studies, though, that the people at most risk are individuals with mild dementia. They are the folks that are driving the most. They've got subtle but notable deficits in some of those key cognitive skills. So that's a challenge. But on the other hand, they're also most likely to pass an on-the-road driving test versus somebody in mid or late stage who would not pass an on-the-road driving test. So it leads us, to this question of when's the right time to assess this? How do you assess it? How do you balance that need for transportation or logistical kind of pieces, or someone's wants, desires, versus public health and safety? We also know from many of these studies that the things that we use day to day in assessment of cognition, whether it's the MoCA or a full-blown neuropsychological evaluation, they're not perfect. There's no magic recipe or formula for, here's the cutoff, Here's the measure that you use, here's when you use it. But they do give us a good sense of how someone's going to do with a driving evaluation. You can augment those with a very careful history. We'll talk about that. And then I think of them as, when is further evaluation needed? So if we look at a survey of primary care providers and their feelings about driving and dementia, mixed feelings at best. So definitely clear need to evaluate for cognitive impairment. Most primary care providers are not aware of what the requirements are in their state. So it would behoove all of us to get familiar with that. We'll talk about it a little bit today too. And then what to do, where do I send somebody? What happens if somebody can't drive anymore? And then of course the all consuming fear that having this conversation or telling someone it's time to retire from driving is going to yield them not coming back. And I have had that happen. It happened recently where somebody is really unhappy because they didn't pass a driving evaluation that I had pushed for pretty strongly. They're not coming back. So, you have to weigh that too. And primary care providers also pretty uniformly see the value of a specialized assessment, although that might depend on what resources you have and where you can send someone. If we go back to the now, oh my gosh, 14-year-old American Academy of Neurology practice parameters. I just checked this morning, they still haven't been updated. They get reaffirmed every couple of years. So 2022 was the last time they got kind of confirmed as, yeah, this is still the state of things. The best evidence is that you shouldn't listen to patients necessarily with dementia about how they think they're doing. They're not good historians for all the right reasons that you would imagine in terms of difficulties with thinking about one's own thinking or perceiving deficits sometimes. Typically people with the CDR 0.5, so MCI or 1, very, very early stage dementia, vast majority will pass it on the road evaluation. But other factors in the presence of a CDR 0.5 or 1, which is just a kind of a rating, a subjective rating, will mitigate that risk in different directions. The next good level of evidence would be that caregivers are rating the person as unsafe, particularly a caregiver, care partner with the right amount of vigilance. And I think we can all think of times with care partners who are hyper vigilant. Every time the wheels touch the yellow line, that's a sign of impaired driving, versus those that are hypo vigilant, oblivious to any changes. Okay, quality evidence would be a mini mental less than 25, although some research studies would say 20, meaning most likely not a candidate to continue driving. Multiple citations or damage to the vehicle, changes in driving habits, and then uncertain is neuropsych eval, and then driving rehab. Can you enhance the candidacy of someone, their driving ability through rehabilitation interventions? So not that you can't, but we just don't have decent enough studies yet. Here's the kind of the parameter that or the rubric that comes from that same paper. So you can see a CDR 2.0 just confirms high risk, but a 0.05 and only a few of these things like history of citations, maybe some situational avoidance, your risk is lower. So again, this is not perfect, but it's at least some framework to start thinking about risk and evaluating risk and what kinds of things. The Canadian family practice parameter has a nice kind of a series of checklists, and the more of these that you have, obviously, the greater the concerns. And this is nice also because it includes some objective cognitive testing, so making test A and B. You do not need to be a neuropsychologist to administer trails A and B. You should get some training and know how to do it, but it's not only for neuropsychologists. And then you can see some of the other pieces here. There was a scoping review that just got published a couple of months ago in Psychogeriatrics that included 14 kind of red flags for driving concerns. And they map on pretty nicely to what I usually think about as my set of questions that I like to ask when I have concerns about driving. we'll usually do kind of a basic screening question, and if everything's fine, or any changes to driving habits or any concerns voiced by the person or collateral, I'll usually leave it alone unless something comes up in testing, and then that's an opportunity afterwards to talk about it. But the things we want to know are, how often do you drive? What's your driving environment like? Are there situations that you're now avoiding? And that's always interesting to ask somebody, "Hey, tell me how your driving habits have changed." Say, well, they haven't. So, okay, so no discomfort driving on the freeway at night in the rain. Oh, well, no, I wouldn't do that. Okay, so how else might they have changed? Uh, you know, the obvious questions about navigation, wayfinding, whether it's, this is a place that I go weekly and I'm having trouble versus I go there every couple of months or once a year. That means something different. It's kind of like trouble with names. Well, names of acquaintances or people you just meet, that's different than names of family members or close friends. Has anybody voiced any concerns? Is there anybody who's not going to ride with you anymore or won't let their other family members ride with you? Speeding, it's a fun question of how fast would you go if you're sure you weren't going to get caught? Red lights, all those kinds of things. People's knowledge about not just alcohol and driving, but medications. Tell me about your medications. Tell me about ones that might change your reaction time or other driving skills. Asking about, are you the recipient of any one finger salutes or other gestures or honking, or are you the giver of those things? Is that a change? Scrapes, dents, mystery marks, things on wheels. These are all things to ask about. Also super important to ask the collateral, the spouse or the adult child or the friend. Ideally, you ask them alone or separately if you get consent to do that. That's not always possible. And I've learned over time too, it's super important to ask, well, when's the last time you actually rode with this person? Oh, wow, it's been a year. Maybe it's time to do a ride along and see what you notice. And there is, in that same article that's referenced, the Iverson 2010, there is a driving safety questionnaire for the person with memory loss and the collateral informant or the care partner. So that's a nice, you can kind of handle those separately. That's a nice way to get some information too without having to verbally mention it. The other thing that I think is important about that assessment is you're planting the seed for what may ultimately be retirement from driving. And that's my favorite phrase. It's the only one, that's the best I can come up with or have heard, versus quitting driving or hanging up the keys or retirement. We all retire from driving for some reason. It might be vision, it might be motor, it might be cognitive, but that kind of ability to start those conversations about what that transition is going to look like and where we're ultimately headed, which will be retirement from driving, more likely than not. If we then kind of get past the qualitative questions and the discussion or the things you're asking about, the history taken to objective assessment, we don't need to go through these in detail. These are for your reference, but you can see that a MoCA of a mini mental of less than 20, everybody failed a standardized on the road test. If it's above 24, 1/3 failed. And I have said this in other didactics. I'll say it again. I'm not recommending the mini mental status examination. It's not the screening test that I would advocate. But if you do use it, there's some data there. The MoCA, a couple of studies that would say a high likelihood of not passing a driving evaluation with MoCA of less than 18, less than 12, pretty much guaranteed you will not pass. Over 27, highly likely to pass. Everything in the middle, it's a coin toss. It really depends on the person, the areas of deficit and preserved strength. And then, of course, the more things we augment the MoCA with, like trail making test or some other things, that helps with sensitivity and specificity. If we turn to neuropsychological evaluations, and I am crystal clear with people that a neuropsychological evaluation is not a driving evaluation. Absolutely not. And it does, though, offer a number of different assessments for some of those key cognitive domains that will give you a pretty good idea of who needs a driving evaluation or whether or not you are likely to pass it or not pass it. So you can see, you know, the visual spatial components, the processing speed, classic tests that go way back. This idea of, you know, alternating attention or being able to inhibit some things while attending to others. These are all critical skills in driving. And there is some indication that individuals with MCI who have depression are more likely to not pass the driving evaluation. So that's another, these individuals are also at greater risk to progress to dementia over a shorter time frame. And you know, the cutoff for some of these things, like the trail making test, which is used in most of the occupational therapy or certified driving rehab specialist evaluations, is 3 minutes for trails B with no errors. That's kind of the cut point for that. So if we go past just the office assessment for someone who needs a more thorough evaluation, and I'm going to look to Karen Clay after we wrap this up to tell us a little bit more about this. There are some changes and some nuances out there, but certainly driving schools offer some types of assessments, more around kind of safety and driver vehicle fit, how to optimize your kind of car. They're not cheap. They do offer some kind of training sessions, and they will sometimes say, boy, you know, we have concerns, you really need to go to the next level, which is an assessment with an occupational therapist or a certified driving rehabilitation specialist. And these vary to a degree, but they typically do things like cognitive screening or assessment, use of field of view, object closure. They will assess, you know, time from, you know, gas pedal to brake, kind of motor speed. They do a few other physical assessments. Many will do some kind of a more functional assessment, including an on-the-road evaluation. For me, the best ones are the ones that are done in your vehicle, in your driving environments. Those have the most ecological validity, but they are not cheap, and they typically are not reimbursed by insurance. Although I have heard from some folks that if done by an occupational therapist and billed as assessing community mobility, there might be better rates of reimbursement, but don't quote me on that. Here's the link for a searchable database. We have a few of these folks in at least the Western Washington region. I know there are some other places in the Northwest with some options too. The other kind of things, depending on the outcomes, are that, and many of the driving evaluations that I read from OTs are, you know, boy, this person seems like they've got some changes in memory, and yeah, you know, their complex attentions need to be a little lower than it would have been without, you know, some kind of a dementia or PCI diagnosis, but they're pretty good to go, especially in these environments. You know, familiar locations under 35 miles an hour, no radio, no conversations, you're just focused on driving. But we need to reassess this every 6 months. And one of the things that we often ask is for that appropriately vigilant care partner to ride along at least once a month to just kind of keep an eye on things. We know from some of those studies that I mentioned earlier that within 6 months, over half of those individuals will not pass their second test. And that becomes more and more true as time goes on. So this really is that opportunity to say, well, you know, you did the evaluation, sounds like you're good to go, but let's really start thinking about what it's going to look like for you to retire from driving, which is likely to happen, more likely to happen in the next year than not. And that is such a hard conversation, and it can't be done quickly, and I don't know that it can always be done just with one conversation, one time point. I think it's super important to validate how difficult this is, that you appreciate that, but you can't then stay stuck on that. You have to kind of move into what are we going to do. A couple of recommendations, you know, that this is not a, you know, especially for somebody who did well on a driving evaluation or is kind of headed towards not doing so well. This is not an all or nothing, you know, right? So how do we modify your driving? how do we think about ways to get you slowly transitioning to other forms of transportation, um, having other people drive maybe once a week, just kind of reducing that kind of exposure and getting used to the idea of not always being the driver. When it comes to you have not passed driving evaluation, or it is time to retire from driving, these are the things that we like to talk about with family of, boy, when the kids come over, maybe don't leave the keys on the counter, and certainly don't talk about the road trip you just took over to Bend or whatever it is. Avoiding arguing about this. I like the whole idea of the care partner being the ones, so let me drive. I haven't driven in so long, and I really need to practice to keep my skills sharp. And I need you to help me with directions. So that kind of finding a role and finding a purpose while not being the main driver. Sometimes people do resort to the keys mysteriously go missing, or the distributor cap is now just going missing. These are kind of last ditch efforts, hopefully. And I'm sure we all have stories of we sold the car, then dad went out and bought another one, or he called the mechanic and came over and he fixed it. So that doesn't always work either. What also can be helpful sometimes is to talk with people about the evidence around driving, to talk about risk. I tend to get a fair amount of buy-in from that piece of, boy, if you got into a questionable fault accident, we've had this conversation about driving, concerns about your candidacy. If you got into a questionable fault accident and the other party's attorney requested your medical records, which they do, and they see in there that you have a neurological or cognitive condition that would undermine your capacity, I can think of 2 stories in the last year where an insurance company said, we're not paying for that. And I can think of another story from many, many years ago where the neurologist, this was at Regina Mason, the neurologist and I did this evaluation. We both came to the conclusion that this woman was not a candidate to continue driving. We both shared that with her, and she said, I hear you, and I've been driving for longer than the 2 of you have been alive put together. And thanks for your input, but no, I'm going to keep driving. And about 4 months later, got into an accident and killed her sister. And both the neurologist and I were subpoenaed by the Attorney General for the state of Washington. So they were thinking about pressing charges. Ultimately, they did not, because it was clear that she's not making good decisions due to dementia. But it was a really ugly, ugly scenario. So and you don't have to get into that story, but to talk about the risks and the fact that, this is something that we are deeply worried about getting worse over time. And sometimes that, boy, I wouldn't want to hurt anybody else, that and the whole like, oh my gosh, it does sound like you've been driving for longer than I've been alive, and you've got a fantastic driving record. Let's go out on top before something tarnishes that record and that legacy. So it's just a couple of things. Just again, these are for your use if they are helpful to you. I love the question of, what would have to happen for you to decide it's time to retire from driving? And usually people will say, well, an accident. Well, let's see, what would the thing before that be? What would the thing before that be? And that's hard. I mean, I think about Barack, your advanced care planning with people with MCI. It's hard to kind of prognosticate or think about what would have to, but you can help somebody with that, right? You can go through a couple of other things of like, well, what if it was, you got lost a couple of times, or what if you had some damage to your car? Yeah, I think that would be time to retire from driving. It sounds like those things have already happened. So what are we going to do? What changes could you make? Resources. The Department of Licensing here has great courses. It's an 8-hour one that will get you an insurance discount, online or in person. We do have a process here in Washington State. Most states do a request for reevaluation. And then, of course, there is physician or provider reporting. Really interesting article that just came out in JAMA Network Open that looked at the 4 states with mandatory reporting of the dementia diagnosis versus states with driver self-reporting with no mandates, and rates of underdiagnosis of dementia. You can see the differences there. That's about 7.8 states without mandatory, and those four, it's 12.4, 12.5. And this is the disconnect between kind of expected rates based for Medicare claims versus what actually is reported. Certainly some methodological issues there, but this issue of, oh my gosh, you know, if I have to report this, where's the incentive to diagnose it? Fortunately, here in Washington, we're not a mandatory reporting state. Oregon is. So again, it's permitted, not required. There are no legal protections, and it is not anonymous. So if the person who has been reported to the DOL and gets that letter and then has to go do the evaluation asks, you know, who turned me in, they're going to tell them it was you as the provider or a family member. So that's a conversation to have sometimes too, is, you know, boy, do you want to be the person, you have to live with this person, this is your loved one. Let us or one of us be the bad guy that does this. You have to weigh the benefits and the risks of that too. And then certainly there is a process for them to obtain a little bit more information. What I have heard here repeatedly is, I'm curious if any of you have stories, but I have not heard of any kind of negative action or liability for a provider reporting someone in good faith. So if you document your concerns, your conversation, the fact that you wrestled with this is ultimately what you decided. I have yet to hear of anybody who's been sued and sanctioned in any way. Again, if acting in good faith and with good documentation. Here's the reporting form. There's the link. That's it. It's one page. Pretty simple, straightforward. In the WWAMI region here, there are some differences. So in Wyoming, for instance, providers are immune from any liability. Montana, again, kind of more of a good faith. Idaho's got some changes. So each state is a little bit different, and it behooves you to kind of know the parameters of where you practice. Another good resource from AGS is this comprehensive, it's huge, it's like 245 pages, assessing counseling of older drivers. So not specifically about dementia, but older adults and driving. So that is handy. Some other local community resources. AAA has a senior driving site program that also talks about, you know, safety things and becoming a more defensive driver as we age. Our area agencies on aging or community living connections have some transportation options, VA. These two resources from the Hartford group I like a lot, At the Crossroads, We Need to Talk. These are for families. I think they're really helpful. There are certain, you know, if you have patients that are part of the VA systems, benefits there. And then, you know, these things change frequently, and I did not confirm that the APDA still has this really cool program for taxi vouchers for medical appointments. They used to, but you know, those vary a little bit. Seem to be a little more volatile in terms of consistency of resources. Some references, and with that, I'm going to stop sharing and happy to open it up to conversation. Questions, comments?
I have a quick question. Hi, I'm Kelly.
Sure.
I'm from Swedish, and you know, you mentioned a really interesting thing that these patients are passing their driving test, but then they're at the most risk at MCI early. I mentioned, so how are you having that conversation? Because usually I'll be like, oh, if you pass the driving test, you know, I can't say anything to you. But it sounds like we should be saying something in that case.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I mean, they're at the most risk because they're driving the most and they're still driving. And I think it highlights that driving tests aren't perfect either, right? I mean, they miss some things, and they're not kind of a one-to-one. Just because you passed it, you are good to go. And if anything, I can think of some folks who have a little bit of like a false sense of security that, oh, I don't need to be extra careful, or I don't need to maybe start making some changes to my driving habits or environments. So I think that is that kind of, did the driving evaluation. Sounds like you're good to go in these environments. And again, that's what I like about the certified driving rehab specialist is it's not just a binary you passed or you failed, but it's typically a good in these areas. Maybe you need to work on some of these things. So that's a way to open that door to, yeah, it sounds like in most environments you're doing well, but there are some changes. There are some places that you're not doing quite as well, and some worries that this is progressive. So in 6 months, for people in your scenario, 4 out of 7 of them aren't going to pass again in 6 months. You could be in the 3. We don't know. We'll find out. I think it's an opportunity to start talking about the. Seems like you're good at the moment, but you have concerns and reasons to be concerned.
So, in the driving form, there's like a 6 months, a 1 year, and a 2 year box for reevaluation. Are you always checking that 6 month box?
I do not check those boxes. I'm curious. So for our primary care providers and neurologists, what boxes do you check? Do you check boxes? I mean, so the AAN practice parameter recommendations that you evaluate in 6 months. I don't know that you necessarily need to do another driving evaluation in 6 months, but some sort of an assessment. I'm looking at Barak squares. I know you've been through this before.
Yeah, I usually say 1 year.
So you put 1 year for that form. Because then the complication is they can't get in at time, and then they get their license suspended, and then they're upset at you even more. What can you do, I guess?
Curious if people have examples of where the conversation's gone really well or hasn't, or things that work for you as you talk about driving with people with whom you work. Goes great for everybody all the time. Nancy, I saw you.
I mean, yeah, I so appreciate your talk, Chris. Such an outstanding, pointing towards all the complexity of the meaning of driving and the independence that it offers. And it's a really challenging conversation. So I think that Barak may have shared this previously, and I'm wondering if people in the community have been in the instance where the person passed the driving evaluation with, as you say, it's not binary, but so with accommodations only locally, not at night, not in stormy, rainy weather, and say they're adhering to that. And you have that care partner, that beloved care partner, signing you in a very unambiguous way that they are sort of, or even they've maybe my chart messaged you prior to that meeting that they have concerns. And I feel like, as you say, if the person, if you think they're not hyper vigilant based on your understanding of them over time, such as you can assess, I take that to heart. And then to language it in a really as respectful as you can be around, we all have to retire, as you said. And I sometimes will use the phrase chauffeur in a kind of slightly playful way, but like, as an elder, let's allow, those who love you to chauffeur you. I don't know. It sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't. sometimes it's just not going to work. And I've had people get very angry with me in the office, and I know, you know, we all have probably been there. Sometimes tag teaming it and following up with like Karen and other members of the team. And sometimes that magical vanishing of the car or disconnecting the power of the car. But it's really hard. Yeah, so that's kind of Brock, would you?
Yeah, I would just you know, the advice that I give to patients, families, primary care doctors is that, you know, we just have to be careful that we don't overthink what our control over people's driving is. You know, I mean, it's not like, you know, when we stop prescribing this medicine, they're going to have no longer have access to it. You know, like the medical control over driving is limited, and we can give our recommendations. And if somebody's MoCA score is less than 20 and we're aware that somebody is driving, you know, we can, those are, you know, thankfully relatively rare situations where we can sort of step in and sort of like, you know, this is, you know, a severe, you know, threat to harm of yourself and others. And, you know, I'm going to sort of, you know, go out on a limb and make some sort of like, try to make some drastic within my limited capacity to stop you from driving. But when things are kind of, you know, in that sort of gray middle zone, you know, all we can do is express our concern and encourage planning and encourage testing and encourage, you know, all the things that Chris has laid out. But we just have to sort of, you know, have some humble appreciation for, you know, what our control over people's actions are limited. And, you know, and I think that, you know, just because somebody loses their license doesn't stop them from driving. You know, if they already have such sort of lack of insight into their limitations that they're driving even though they clearly shouldn't, just like not having a license is also like not necessarily going to stop them from driving. And so I think we just have to also not, you know, put more weight into, you know, what the effect of losing one's license is. And so that's where you kind of, you get down to that sort of, you know, thankfully rare situation where you really do need to, you know, advise that people are physically removed from their ability to drive. And, you know, so I would just like couch it as this is a huge problem and it's really, really difficult. But thankfully, it is relatively rare that you get down to that kind of nuclear option situation where you have to sort of hide the keys or hide the car. Because eventually people do start becoming anxious about getting behind the wheel and they don't want to do it anymore. And you can reduce the chances of somebody wanting to override that because they're so desperate to drive by introducing other ways for them to get around. But oh my God, this is a really, really, really hard nugget of dementia care that there are no easy answers for.
Chrissy? Nope, you had a hand up. Maybe not. How about Reza?
I can share my story.
Oh, sure. Let's do that. Right. Yeah, there you go, Reza. You're unmuted, and Toby after that. Sure.
I usually start with asking this question from the wife, that how you feel safe when he drives. And if she says, I feel safe, I say, how you feel if your children or your grandkids drive with him? If the answer is that I don't feel safe, then I offer a driving evaluation, which we have a good one at Evergreen Hospital. So they divide the people to 3 groups. Actually, it's very interesting because some of the patients I thought they never passed the test, they passed the test. And some of them that I really thought that they are going to pass the test, they failed the test. So they divided to 3 zones, basically. One group is a group that they are able to drive, but most of the time they are able to drive locally, and sometimes with another passenger. Next group are the group who fails, and some group are between, basically. The group are between, they usually send them for a road test. I think there is a occupational therapist who does the road tests, and he is in Edmonds or Linwood probably. It costs about $400 something for that. And that person says, hey, cannot drive. Then my next step is approaching to the children, family members, see if they are going to, what they are going to do for the driving, or if they fail the test. You know, giving the scenario that it's a real patient I had when I was in Longview that just came to see me as a new patient. And I saw this lady was very anxious, very upset. I said, what happened? She said she had a car accident and hit two junior school students. So, and that was horrible. She has to go to court. It was too much stress for that person. I don't know what happened. Eventually I left before see what the court result was, but you know, at age 90, 85, being involved in some legal issues is very a huge problem for these people. So I always tell this story to them. And it's not just you, it's the story of the, you know, other people also. Most of the time, family are very supportive. And I'm honest, if they, you know, if they say that, no, I'm gonna drive, I report them. At least that's my job. I tell them that I'm going to report you. If I don't do that, your neighbors, many times I see the neighbors report them actually to the DMV. So that's my approach. But I have a question. When I was in fellowship, we used to do the trail tracking test for screening of these patients with, you know, driving evaluation. How do we do it? Do we still do it? I haven't done it for a long, long time, but, and how valuable is the test? Thank you.
Yeah, good question. I do not do that one. I've worked with an occupational therapist who used to do that, and it was a piece of a larger battery, including like useful field of view. They also did like the timed up and go test, a few other physical metrics. And then there was it was, I don't know if there's any literature around sensitivity and specificity, but I know, you know, some OTs do. So, I don't know anybody currently uses it, but if anybody else does, love to hear it. Toby, you were gonna share something also.
Yeah, I just wanted to share kind of my personal story, because my dad, when he was diagnosed with dementia, this is in Israel, my dad lives in Israel, so he basically refused to, you know, people said, oh, you know, it's not safe for you to drive, and it wasn't safe, and he was just refusing to give up his license. Eventually, you know, we took him to a psychiatric person who basically didn't say he shouldn't drive, and he was so angry, and it took him such a long time, about a year, to kind of to accept the verdict. He just kept fighting. He was calling me to, you know, well, I'm living here in Seattle, US, and you should call this physician, he's wrong, you should talk with him, you know, and he just like didn't give up, and he was so upset because this was for him really kind of giving up his kind of independency. And then he moved to assisted living, and he didn't have a license, but he still said, no, I'm not going to sell the car, I'm going, because, and again, he kind of repealed it. And so I was so surprised to see how much like it was so important for him. And then I realized this kind of driving component for him was like his kind of the statement of for himself that he still owned like his own autonomy. And I think I mean, for me, it was kind of turning point to understand like how driving, like you said, it's so and it was really hard for me, like Nancy said, it's so complicated to, so I'm not sure the right thing is just like somebody, well, it was good because I said, you know, yeah, you were assessed by a physician and this is his expertise, and you know, also your kid says it's not safe for you, but you know, he was not like, he didn't have any insight, and it was really hard. So I think, I mean, I don't know, I just bring it out my personal story, but I really want to share because I think it's very relevant. So yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's so hard. I think of somebody, you reminded me of another person here who accidentally, because they were having trouble paying their bills, let their insurance lapse. And they were old enough that their insurance company was not going to reinsure them, or it was going to be exorbitant. And that was their motivation to stop driving. So they had that kind of community mindedness that I'm not, and liability mindedness of I'm not going to drive without insurance, so therefore I'm stuck to drive. But not everybody's going to have that either. Karen Clay, I found myself wondering as I was talking, like, what am I missing here? Are there other resources or updates that, because I know you deal with this.
I would say from a practical standpoint, I think we talked a little bit about the certified rehabilitation specialists that are here. There's actually, as far as I know, only 3 programs in Washington State. One in Edmonds, Drive Rehab Services, $600. They travel throughout Eastern Washington. Northwest Driver Rehab, $650. Also drives throughout Western Washington. And then over in Spokane area, have it better because they are able to, and these are for the on-the-road driving piece. They have it better because it's clinic-based, and so they're actually able to bill for parts of it. So you kind of start with in-home evaluation, and then then I think you also do some driving, and that's part that can be paid for by insurance. And then if you do well enough, then you get behind the road, and then the driving piece is a lot less expensive because that other part has been compensated. And so really, and I just looked on the website for the occupational therapist too, and I know there's one that was listed for Northwoods. I did call them just about a month ago. They don't have that service. Either does CHS, which is where Jen Fox used to work for Drive Rehab Services. So just really sparse resources and extraordinarily expensive. So sort of bringing up equity issues for our folks too, when they can't afford that $650, when they don't have that luxury. So there is that provider judgment. It is good to, that some of these other programs are offering some in-clinic evaluations as maybe a way to start that conversation. But just like we all agreed, even losing your license isn't a guarantee that people aren't going to be getting behind the wheel. When you were talking about the nuclear option of removing access to the car, I guess I feel like the nuclear action is to actually call the police, because I do have people who say, like, I've tried to remove the vehicle, I've tried to do all these things, and they still somehow manage to get in cars. And I do instruct family members that actually the right thing to do when somebody doesn't have a driver's license and is clearly at that point where they can't drive, that it's actually appropriate to call 911 and do the report that this is a person with known dementia who does not have a legal driver's license, and asking for assistance with that. And that's, fortunately, that's really, really, really rare. But I do think that's the appropriate advice. Maybe other people disagree. Far and away, I think the most important parts are that sort of like, who's the best person to be communicating this information? Like, how can we kind of start transitioning out earlier? So those earlier conversations about kind of starting to just get used to other ways of being independent is really the most important thing.
Sorry, I'm eating my sandwich, but I just posted in the chat. I use Jennifer Fox, and she's in Linwood. I'm sorry, I don't know the price. I was thinking like $300 to $400.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
thought is that who you're talking about?
Yeah, Jen Fox is synonymous. That's her own company, the Drive Rehab services that you put there. And so she is 600. Was the last time I spoke with her.
Actually.
Yeah, and she used to be 650, which is what Northwest Drive Rehab was, and she cut her price down to $600. But yeah, she's one of the 3 folks that offer that service.
Do we have any like scholarships or any thoughts of like funding this for patients, like through what Swedish services, or your healthcare company, or I don't know.
Sorry, I missed that. I got distracted here. Was that a request for resources?
Yeah, I mean, if it's so expensive and you have a patient who just can't afford it, like how do we help them with that? Or we just can't, it's just that income, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, and I wonder, you know, that idea of what could you do? You know, is some limited assessment by an occupational therapist or maybe a neuropsychologist even, who is not a driving specialist, is that better than no evaluation, or is that maybe more dangerous? So, you know, because you're making decisions off, you know, less than an optimal evaluation. So I think that's probably a person by person, patient by patient scenario dependent situation. But I think about some of the evaluations that some of the other OTs do. So they're not certified driving rehab specialists, but they do some driving evaluations. And, you know, is that maybe an option? Looking up what I got distracted by here was looking up the American Occupational Therapy Association here in Washington. There are 5 programs found, but some of the, like, so say St. Luke's over in Spokane, the one for Issaquah, someone out in Silverdale who doesn't seem to be a certified driving rehab specialist.
Is that the Northwoods one?
That's the Northwoods Lodge. Yep.
Yeah, they called them and they haven't offered that service for a while.
Wow.
Yeah, I just looked as well too. And then the CHC, that's the one where Jen Fox used to work there. And so they're not offering driving services, but Jen Fox is under the name of the drive rehab services. That's the one that Kelly put in there for us.
And I know they were doing them at the VA for a while here in Seattle. I don't know if that's still an option if you have veterans to work with.
Yeah, I wonder about that too. I actually don't know. Yeah, they don't come up in the list of driving rehab people, but I had heard that they were offering driving rehabilitation services.
Same thing with UW Rehab Medicine over at Montlake. They were at one point doing some limited evaluations, but I'm not sure that they still are.
I know in our clinic, sometimes we are, the drive rehabilitation programs can help for people when they need that sort of external person saying, because I think when we talk about not driving, I think sometimes people already have a sense that it's not safe, but nobody is really able to sort of say, like, don't do it. So I think that does sort of put back the onus on, like, who's the best person to be the bad guy to come down on that.
Over the years, I've kind of come around to understand why this is such a hard service to access. And there was a moment I had a few years ago where I tried to imagine like going into this business myself, where, my full-time job was to get behind the wheel with people with dementia. And it was like, wow, that is a really, really hard job to have, and has, a huge amount of kind of like risk and liability. I mean, it's one thing to be a family member and get behind the wheel with a family member once in a while, or to be aware that like any of the cars that are sort of like on the road with you could be somebody with dementia. That's like one thing. But the idea that like day in and day out from like 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, your job is to be behind the wheel of somebody who has dementia is really, really hard. And I can just imagine how concentrating the evaluation in that way is a difficult task to ask anybody to take on.
Any other points of discussion or things that have worked well for you? Or
I have one other thought, and this was from some families that have had success, and it follows along with what you've already said, but to have the person gift their car to the younger generation, and there's that buy-in, and this is who I would want. It's an opportunity. Maybe a little bit of trouble sometimes if you forget you've gifted it, and this is my car. But sometimes early on that can work really well and just be a point of pride of, I am now letting my grandchild drive me around, or have this to go off to college, whatever it may be. Sometimes that's a nice way to hand over the keys.
I've had luck with insurance liability. I don't know how to say it, but you know, if they're in an accident and then they pull the medical charts and they find they have dementia or memory problem, they're liable either way. So sometimes I'll explain that and then people are like, oh, you're right. Like this is, I don't want to pay whatever that will be because I will be at the at fault driver. I think that's my like back pocket kind of thing that was the most successful.
But Dr. Kelly, I've never been in an accident before and I'm still a very good driver. Yeah, it's hard.
That was a tough one.
The other thing that I'm thinking about somebody else a little while ago who the wife just started gradually. She was like, I just grabbed the keys and we never talked about it. It was never an explicit kind of conversation, but I just started driving and he seemed to not really care. So it wasn't this big kind of blow up, heavy talk, just as she made the change and kind of went with it.
I do feel like that sometimes later on where you run into like, oh my goodness, that complete retirement from driving. Oh yeah, we don't do the long distance anymore, but you've had the conversation and a year or two later you realize, oh, wait, there's still those little drives to the store. And that's what it's like, you don't want to keep having the conversation, but then you might miss that retirement conversation was not a complete retirement.
Right, and most accidents happen within a mile of the home.
Yeah, I don't know if others have, like, sometimes it just kind of slips out in conversation, but that balance of how much do you check in, you know, could it be just a questionnaire that you give out? Is the person still driving anywhere? But the level of clarification is just sometimes humbling.
For me, like an interesting framework to have is to think about like just how important it is that to really put a patient with dementia who is isolated or living alone or living with somebody else who is likely cognitively impaired is its own very special sort of category of dementia care. And that that generally speaking, like you were saying, that generally if somebody has a spouse who is very cognitively intact or has a, you know, it is like closely attached to you know, sons or daughters who are closely attached, that usually this will just sort of like, you know, naturally kind of like organically sort of like fade away as an issue and is not something that necessarily needs like a heavy hand to address. But this is really on the short list of like high impact problems for the subset of people who are living alone or living with somebody else who is likely cognitively impaired. That's the situation where driving is just like one of the 5 things that are, you know, likely to sort of like, you know, reach crisis state, in which that is just like, and so it's not just the driving that is going to be the sort of difficult problem to address, but it's like the whole package of sort of, you know, making that shift from independent living to not independent living, and how is that going to happen?
I appreciate Marcy's comment in the chat here that it's also difficult to determine changes in someone's driving due to dementia when they weren't the best driver to begin with. And maybe that's the person you have extra concerns about because they're already at some risk and now there's some additional risk. But yeah, it is kind of hard to know.
I think it's important to like just acknowledge that, you know, somebody who has, you know, alcohol use disorder, and you know that they have alcohol use disorder and they have been sort of like, you know, had multiple DUIs, you know, like what is your sort of like role and ability as a healthcare provider to sort of like take their keys away? You know, I mean, it's just like, it's just, you know, driving is just like really, really complex and hard and scary. And we just have to accept, you know, the ways in which we do have some sort of affect and ways in which we are sort of at the mercy of the complex society that we live in.
Reza?
Two actually point. The first one is here is basically the cognitive chat. We talk about cognition, we talk about memory, but aging is reality. I mean, as a geriatrician, I see many people with macular degeneration, with hearing problem, with arthritis, and so this should be I mean, it's not, I think the main problem starts after age 85. I know you guys probably know that. We call young old between 65 to 75, 76 to 85 is old, and older than 85, we call them old. So the main issue starts after age 85, I believe, and I mean, generally you see a significant decline after this age. I myself would like to be retired from driving between 80 to 85. That's my plan. But there are many patients, they said, no, I want to drive forever. So it could be it can be a state, legislation. And I'm not saying to ban them from driving, but for example, how 15 years old shouldn't drive, and they should be 16 to be able to drive. Why we let people to go forever? And in our textbooks in geriatrics, we call them that the geriatric patients are very different from the younger, from the adults. Why? Because of the body changes, significant decline. Why? There is no limit for older age. And I think not banning it from driving, but at least anybody reach, for example, to age 80 has to go to driving evaluation by a state, vision, a mini mental test, something like that, every 6 months to just screen them. And it's standards for themselves and other people. So yeah, I think it's mainly not just one problem. It's a multifactorial, vision, hearing, all of those things. Thank you.
That's a really great point. And, so I skipped over it pretty quickly, but in Idaho, at age 62, you then have to go in person every 4 years to renew your license with the vision tests. In Montana, all licenses expire at age 75, and you have to renew them every 4 years. So there are some states that have made some kind of similar moves, realizing that it's not always cognition. Sometimes it's vision, sometimes it's mobility or other things. So, who knows what Washington will do? Call your legislator. Well, it's 1:25. I see Kathy put something in the chat here. Kathy, do you want to unmute? We got a couple of minutes if you want to share something.
Well, I was just sharing, my dad is not the one, I guess, fortunately, that has the cognition issue. It's more my mother, and she hasn't been driving for years. But I recently my dad just turned 85 this spring, and he really had heartburn surrendering the license. It's like that physical thing in his wallet that had been there for 65 years or more, and I learned, and I was dreading going to the DMV. I was just so worried that they weren't going to handle it well and that they were going to be insensitive and he was going to be angry. But he actually took it really well, because what they said to him is, you can come back anytime if you feel like you can pass these tests, but I know today you can't. And so we're going to give you, a state ID. So he actually left with something to put on his wallet. I don't think he'll ever drive again, but I also know that he knows he can't right now. And I think him being able to acknowledge that is important. But also I think that physical ID and just giving him something that says, you are still this person and all that meant something to him. And I think I didn't realize the value of that, of what that actually stood for him. So. Yeah,
well, thank you for sharing that. I wouldn't have thought of that either. For me, the fewer things in my wallet, the better. So glad to get rid of it. But interesting. Well, and again, that's 65 years, right? I mean,
yeah, he's been driving, probably since he was 18 or 16, so he's 85. But, I think the thing is that when you get older, your life gets real simple, especially if you live in a community. He's not out shopping, he's not doing a lot. So he's carrying one credit card, his medical ID card, and an ID, right? And so for him, he's like, hey, I want that. And I want you to take away from me. So, it's good. It was a good it was a good lesson for a daughter to realize and listen to what really was the need there. So,
Thank you for sharing that.
yeah.
All right, well, let's wrap it up here. We'll give you 2 minutes back in your day. So again, case is great. Oh, just a reminder for CME. So here is that number. If you claim that if you're a UW faculty, staff, or student. And then, our next session on July 12th will be the update on lecanemab. We have a number of folks now on treatment here at the University of Washington, and our own Dr. Rosenblum, who has been instrumental in that, and one of our clinical trialists will be giving us an update. So looking forward to that. And then that is what I have for you. And thank you all.